Hello guys, I'm Chad and today we're going to talk about airbrush maintenance and troubleshooting and just airbrush stuff. This is my Iwata Eclipse HPCS. This is my workhorse for all my painting, including my primers, all my color paints, everything. This pretty much does everything for me. So this HPCS, the Iwata Eclipse, it runs a 3.5 millimeter needle, which I think for modeling, 1/25th scale, we can see here this brand new Revell's 1970 Pontiac Firebird that I'm getting ready to paint. And then I ran into a problem with my airbrush. My airbrush quit working. So that's still in primer, waiting for paint. And the part finally came in for my airbrush. So I'm going to just walk through general airbrush maintenance and disassembly, and we'll walk through replacing my problem part together and see how this works. So first of all, well, one of the things I picked up a while ago, and I highly recommend if you're going to be doing a lot of airbrushing, is to get an airbrush maintenance kit. This is an Iwata airbrush, and Iwata makes an airbrush cleaning, disassembly, maintenance kit, and this thing is great. It's got a spot in here. Here's my old Badger single action that I started with. A tube for your extra needles. A nice little pouch for parts. This is the part we're going to be replacing today. Handy dandy notebook. It walks you through basically what all the tools are, what their uses are. Very, very handy. And these will be some of the tools that we'll be using today. So I'll go over some of those when we get to them. All right, so first of all, what was happening was my trigger was sticking. Now there's a couple of different things for that. You can get paint. Sometimes paint will get past your needle packing, your needle bearing or bushing down into your valve assembly. Sometimes that'll cause it to stick. A lot of times when I'm cleaning, I have my needle out. Sometimes I'll get cleaning solution or fluid down in there, and it'll kind of create a vacuum or make that piston valve swell a little bit, or piston bushing swell a little bit and cause that trigger to kind of slowly come back up. So you'll push it and it'll slowly come back up. But so I took it apart, went to clean it, put my trigger back in, and it would not go in. It was pressing against something soft. It was pressing against the rubber seal, and I could not get it to seat. And eventually took it all apart a couple times and figured out that this was my problem. So my piston packing ring, O-ring, had basically come apart in there, and it was causing impediment to the trigger. So I am going to replace this today with you guys, and I'll just walk through the entire airbrush because basically I have to disassemble the entire airbrush anyway to get to it. So I'll remove your housing assembly, and apologize if sometimes my vocabulary or my verbiage is a little bit wrong or off, but anyway, so take your needle out. Be careful with that. Of course, you don't want to damage your needle. Set that aside where it's not going to roll away. Your needle chuck, we can take that off. And of course, once you have your needle out, your trigger will just come right out. And then we're going to take our needle housing out the back, unscrew that. This has a couple of different parts. It's got a spring in there, so this just slides off. It just clamps down, and it's got that spring on there. Of course, it goes up to your up against your trigger, so don't lose that spring. These parts generally don't really need cleaning. If you want, you can put a little bit of oil on your threads to kind of help it stay lubricated and on and off easier. But generally, if everything's working the way it should, these should not be dirty. You should not be getting paint back this far in your airbrush. If you are, then there's some other problems up. Probably your needle bearing or the bushing in here is probably not tight enough. So of course, this is a double action gravity fed airbrush. I love it. So we'll just take our needle guard off, our nozzle cap. And then for this, you just need a little little wrench that comes with the airbrush, or at least mine did. And this you don't want tight, super tight when you're putting it back on. I'll go over that in a sec. Just basically snug is all you want. So finger tight, and then just a little bit of turn just to give it a little snugness to get on there. So we're going to take that off, and of course our nozzle assembly. A couple things you want to be careful with on this. We can see our nozzle here. A lot of times the end, it's really hard to see, but the end here, if you're getting spitting or improper paint flow, you get a line off to the side or something, a lot of times this will be trumpeted. It'll kind of flare out because the more the needle goes in and hits against the back of that, it'll kind of flare it out, or it'll have a crack in it. So that's one thing to look for when you're getting inconsistent paint flow onto your target. And there is a tool in there that kind of, well, I'll just show you that right now since we're there. If you need to replace that in the kit, there's this nozzle wrench, and you just fit that over there nice and careful, and you can unscrew that off. Now mine's fine. I've already replaced this once already because I was getting that trumpeting. It wasn't that bad, but I noticed it was starting, so I just went ahead and replaced it so I wasn't getting paint spitting onto my cars. Another thing that's helpful when you're doing this is Iwata has a parts tray. I don't have one, so I just kind of keep an eye on. Hopefully things don't roll off my table and I lose them in the carpet forever. But you know, if some little parts tray, a dish, or something like that, just to kind of keep things from rolling around, is handy to have. There is one more O-ring that's on the front of this. Sometimes I'll kind of take that off, clean it a little bit, drop a little bit of oil on there. You don't want to get too much oil, especially you don't want to be mixing oils with paint, because that kind of causes some obvious issues there as well. With my airbrush, when I purchased the Iwata, it comes with this super lube. This is really good stuff. I use this on my needle. But I find that it's kind of thick and sticky when it starts to dry, so I don't generally put it on a lot of my other parts. But if you want, you can add, what I have done, and this is probably gonna make some people scream, but I have used just a little tiny dab of 3-in-1 oil, just a little tiny bit, and get it on that rubber bushing and put it back on. But again, be careful with that. You don't want a lot of oil, especially when you're spraying. That's going to cause some problems with your paint. So we've pretty much got the airbrush completely disassembled. I'm going to leave that O-ring on there because I don't want it going anywhere. The next part we need to get to is we're going to work on getting this piston, the air piston, out of here. And of course, there's a handy tool for that in the tool kit. This little guy right here. So what we're going to do, this is spring loaded, so be careful when this comes out. Generally there's not a lot of pressure behind it, so it's not going to shoot parts everywhere. But be careful because it is a little spring loaded, and it just kind of pops that out of there. So be careful with that. Your locking ring, your little spring will come out, and then there's a part of the piston. There we go. Sometimes you'll need to. Sometimes that'll have a little tension on it, especially if the piston bushing or O-ring is working right. So, and then that'll come out. I'm just going to leave that spring on there so that doesn't go anywhere. So there's a little groove in there where the bushing actually sits, and if you can kind of grab that and just kind of slide that piston out of there. And there is a seal right there that we want to be careful not to damage. So this is our piston. So what happens is air comes up through here. Of course, when you push the trigger down, pushes this valve body down and allows air up in between here. You can see in these holes. But the problem is, for me, this piston, this O-ring sits on top like this. And because it was damaged, first of all, it wouldn't allow my trigger to seat. But if that is bad or broken or damaged, the air will actually pass up through the trigger and come out of here instead of being forced or guided through the airbrush body. So let's set that aside. Now, one more thing is our needle bushing, our needle bearing. This is the tool for that. So this actually slides in the middle of where the needle would seat, in the middle of that. And then it's got a screwdriver head on the end of it right there. So that's a very, very handy tool for this. Exactly designed for this job. And this needle bearing you do not want very tight at all. You just want it barely snug. And the other thing that's handy about this is you can test your tension. So your needle, basically this is taking the place of your needle, and it slides back and forth in the opening there, and you can tighten it and feel your tension. So it's a little bit tight right there, and I just barely tightened it down. So that's a handy tool for a couple of different reasons. All right, so we're just gonna go ahead. Oh, I can tell I've got a little tension with that screw coming out. So I've probably got some buildup in there that we're gonna wanna probably try to clean up. There we go. All right, so yeah, there's a little bit of buildup on there we're gonna clean. And of course, this little part is our actual needle bearing. I will try to scrub some of this paint and buildup off of the back. And also, I'm going to run a brush down through here now that that's out of there, and see if I can scrub some of that out. So we've got that completely broken down. Now, this airbrush, the Iwata Eclipse, does tout that its O-rings are solvent resistant. So you can use solvent-based cleaners, things like that, solvent-based paints. That's what it's designed for. But at this point, it's completely broken down. If you wanted to soak this body, the airbrush housing, in some cleaner, in a sonic bath or something like that. So I'm just going to use some scrub brushes, and then we're going to reassemble it and see if we can get this little guy back up in where it's supposed to be and get my airbrush up and running again. So for cleaning, I actually just have some Tamiya, the lacquer thinners that I have dumped out into a jar. Picked this up at Hobby Lobby. It's the Silicoil. It's very handy for cleaning hand brushes. One of the other things I recommend also is cleaning brushes, some little wire brushes, various sizes you can see here. Another thing that you can get is, one of the things that this is good for is kind of getting around the cup, the airbrush paint cup, and kind of getting into some of those grooves in there. I don't use this a whole lot. One of the other brushes I found that I use the most, as you can see my bristles are starting to show signs of use, is I can use this to kind of scrub the paint around, get my airbrush cup clean. If I'm in between colors, and at the end of my paint sessions, I always clean out my brushes, my airbrush, get it ready for the next time. And I find that this I can get around in the edges if I need to as well. So this is very handy. I have used this a couple times, but I find I don't really use it a lot because I have this brush that works for me. All right, on to cleaning. Alright, so we will put everything back together again in reverse order. Hopefully we don't lose any parts or have extra ones left over. It's better if we have extra ones left over because then we can take them apart, and if we miss something, which I usually tend to have to do things 2 or 3 times. So we'll see how this goes. I'm not going to put any oils or anything on this because that's way too close to the needle bearing. I don't want any contaminants getting in the way of painting. So we're just going to very lightly screw this back in, and it's seated right there. So now we're going to test our tension. A little loose, just a hair more. That feels a little tight. You want it to be a little snug because you don't want paint getting in between your needle and your needle bushing back behind into this, the housing back here, the air valve piston area. That's where you don't want paint. So you do want that to be kind of at a ideal tension, and you just kind of have to play with that. Like I said, this tool is perfect for that because you can test your tension. That feels pretty snug, so maybe we'll try that. If you screw it down too much, you're going to pinch your needle. When you have your needle in there and you pull your needle back and you let go, it's going to stay back. It'll just bind it up too much, put too much pressure on it. Alright, so we've got our bushing back in. Let's put our piston valve back in, and I am going to put a little tiny bit of oil on there because I want this bushing to slide up into the housing without pinching and getting that O-ring damaged. So once again, my trusty 3-in-1 oil, and we just want just enough. Get a little bit on there just to help that guide up in there. And at this point, this is where I want my piston O-ring, is what we are after for this whole event. That's why we're doing this. So hopefully this is the part where we're gonna see how this works. Now, I couldn't really find that much of a resource or guides on how to do this, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this video, is to kind of experiment with you guys. I believe it goes right there. I don't know that it goes on top of or in that groove, but I think it's ideally it's supposed to set on top of the piston. And like I said, there is a groove up in here. We will see. Let's try something. This might be too short. Oh no. That way I can keep that as a guide. Get careful with pinching your O-rings, so kind of get that the piston body up in there nice and smooth. Let's put our trigger in here and see what kind of resistance we get. That feels pretty good. Huh. Well, that was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. Interesting. All right. Well, let's continue with reassembly and see how this works. Again, this tool, there's nothing that makes a job easier than having the right tool for the right job. And with these little pieces in here, that couldn't be more true with these Airbrush maintenance kit from Iwata. So again, you don't need to get this on there real tight, just snug, and that looks pretty good. All right, everything's feeling pretty good so far. Now that we got our spring in, let's test our trigger again and see if we have spring tension now. And that feels pretty good. You can see the piston valve coming down, the piston assembly coming down. We got some good spring resistance there, some good tension. Everything's feeling really good. So we shall see if this works. Finger tight on this one. So they have these neat pliers here that have Teflon coating in the jaws, which allow for a couple of, obviously we can grip some things without scarring our metals. Again, this just needs to be finger tight, but just kind of showing you, I don't use my pliers for this, just kind of showing you what they're designed for. Actually, one of probably the biggest thing I use this for are these two little guys right here. Sometimes I'll get them, get a little bit too much tension on there and I can't get them off. So these come in handy, perfect for that, and I'll show you that in just a second. I do want to put a little bit of oil on this O-ring here, just to give it a little bit of conditioning coating on there, just to help it last a little longer, not dry out too much. But I don't really want this oil all over the place, so get this O-ring back on. Just snap it on, it comes on pretty smooth. All right, so the next thing I'll do is put in my nozzle cap. Careful, you don't want to damage any of these little fragile parts here, your nozzle especially. Again, tighten that down finger tight, and then our handy dandy little nozzle wrench, or I'm sorry, the housing wrench, and just a little turn to kind of snug it up, and that's it for that. Of course, this one goes on again, just finger tight with that. Sometimes, like I said, sometimes that gets a little stubborn to get off, which is where these pliers come in handy, just to kind of grip that on there and get it to come off. But again, everything I just put on there finger tight with the exception of that wrench, just to crank that down just a little bit. And this guy, our cap, our needle cap, that's just designed to protect the end of the needle, as you'll see the needle sticking out there when we're using the airbrush, and that's designed so you don't bump it onto something and bend the tip of your needle. So this I just keep on there because sometimes I'll take this off. You'll see a lot of guys especially do a lot of detail painting. They'll just have that needle, that cap completely off and airbrush like that. It gives you a little bit ability to get closer to your artwork and get a little bit more control. But for general purpose, you know, again, what we're doing with mostly model cars, things like that, I mostly leave that on there. If you get a lot of times too, one of the things with airbrushing, especially with acrylic paints, is you'll get needle tip dry, they call it, where the paint is actually drying on the tip of your needles. So guys will paint with this off so they can, you'll see guys as they're painting, it almost becomes a habit. They're just picking off the dried paint on the end of their needles so they don't get tip dry as much. But again, I mean, I use mostly solvent-based paints, so you don't get tip drying as much with the solvent base. And then our needle tightening chuck screw here. And then finally our needle. So one of the things, we'll just go over that while we're here. So sometimes after I'm done with a paint session, I go through and I just kind of clean everything up real quick. I'll get a little bit of oil on my finger and then I'll just rub it, just kind of twist my needle in and then rub it up on my needle. Now you'll notice I'm going away from the tip and not towards the tip because this is a needle and it is very sharp, as it's supposed to be. And it will poke you, as it has done to me. All right, learning through painful experience. And then I'll usually put my finger on the back here as a guide, because again, this is probably if you're going to damage your needle in and out, this is probably the point you're going to do it, unless you drop it, which again I have done. This is my second needle I've gone through. So we want to slide that in there, and you'll feel it hit up against, if you have your tension, which actually that feels really good. You have your tension up here on your needle bearing. And a lot of times, since I've got some lube on there, I'll kind of twist it once I get into that needle bearing as I'm pushing it in, just to add some of that lube to the needle bearing as well. And then when we come in, we don't want to jam it in there again because we don't want to blow out the end of our nozzle. So we just want to push it in there until it seats. And that's it, and lock it up, test and make sure everything's working properly. Everything feels really good. I am really excited to get my airbrush back up and running again. And that's it. We have disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled my entire airbrush.